Okay. Hello, chapter 21. I'm going to 449, I think. Yeah, I think 449. Yes. I listened back to one of these and I realized there's this annoying buzzing, and I don't know what it's coming from, but it's really annoying. It might be where I'm sitting. I'm not sure, but it sucks. Oh well. Sorry, I was yawning. I started the first page in another video, but oh my god, my enunciation is like terrible right now, so I'm sorry if I'm reading poorly. So let's try again. When President Lincoln issued his call to the states for 75,000 militiamen on April 15, 1861, he envisioned them serving for only 90 days. Reaffirming his limited war aims, he declared that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. With the swift flourish of federal force, he hoped to show the folly of secession and rapidly return the rebellious states to the Union. But the war was to be neither brief nor limited. When the guns fell silent 4 years later, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides lay dead. Slavery was ended forever, and the nation faced the challenge of reintegrating the defeated but still recalcitrant South into the Union. Bull Run ends the 90-day war. Northern newspapers, at first sharing Lincoln's expectation of a quick victory, raised to the cry, "On to Richmond!" In this yeasty atmosphere, a Union army of some 30,000 men drilled near Washington in the summer of 1861. It was ill-prepared for battle, but the press and the public clamored for action. Lincoln eventually concluded that an attack on a smaller Confederate force at Bull Run, Manassas Junction, some 30 miles southwest of Washington, might be worth a try. If successful, it would demonstrate the superiority of the Union arms. It might even lead to the capture of the Confederate capital at Richmond, 100 miles to the south. If Richmond fell, secession would be thoroughly discredited, and the Union could be restored without damage to the economic and social system of the South. Raw Yankee recruits swaggered out of Washington toward Bull Run on July 21, 1861, as if they were headed for a sporting event. Congressmen and spectators trailed along with their lunch baskets to witness the fun. At first, the battle went well for the Yankees, but Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, Jackson's gray-clad warriors, stood like a stone wall, where here he won his nickname, and Confederate reinforcements arrived unexpectedly. Panic seized the Green Union troops, many of whom fled in shameful confusion. The Confederates, themselves too exhausted or disorganized to pursue, feasted on captured lunches. The military panic at Bull Run, though not decisive militarily, bore significant psychological and political consequences, many of them paradoxical. Victory was worse than defeat for the South because it inflated an already dangerous overconfidence. Many of the Southern soldiers promptly deserted, some boastfully to display their trophies, others feeling that the war was now surely over. Southern enlistments fell off sharply, and preparations for a protracted conflict slackened. Defeat was better than victory for the Union because it dispelled all illusions of a one-punch war and caused the Northerners to buckle down to the staggering tasks at hand. It also set the stage for a war that would be waged not merely for the cause of union, but also, eventually, for the abolitionist ideal of emancipation. Tardy George McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign. Northern hopes brightened later in 1861 when General George B. McClellan was given command of the Army of the Potomac, as the major Union force near Washington was now called. Red-haired and red-mustached, strong and stocky, McClellan was a brilliant 34-year-old West Pointer. As a serious student of warfare who was dubbed Young Napoleon, he had seen plenty of fighting, first in the Mexican War and then as an observer of the Crimean War in Russia. Cocky George McClellan embodied a curious mixture of virtues and defects. He was a superb organizer and drill master, and he injected splendid morale into the Army of the Potomac. Hating to sacrifice his troops, he was idolized by his men, who affectionately called him Little Mac. But he was a perfectionist who seems not to have realized that an army is never ready to the last button, and that wars cannot be won without running some risks. He consistently but erroneously believed that the enemy outnumbered him, partly because his intelligent reports from the head of Pinkerton's detective agency were unreliable. He was overcautious. Lincoln once accused him of having the slows, and he addressed the president in an arrogant tone that a less forgiving person would never have tolerated. Privately, the general referred to his chief as a baboon. As McClellan doggedly continued to drill his army without moving it toward Richmond, the derisive northern watchword became all quiet along the Potomac. The song of the hour was Tardy George McClellan. After threatening to borrow the army if it was not going to be used, Lincoln finally issued firm orders to advance. A reluctant McClellan at last decided upon a waterborne approach to Richmond, which lies at the western base of a narrow peninsula formed by the James and York rivers, hence the name given to the historic encounter, the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan warily inched towards the Confederate capital in the spring of 1862 with 100,000 men. After taking a month to capture historic Yorktown, which bristled with imitation with imitation wooden cannon, he finally came within sight of the spires of Richmond. At this crucial juncture, Lincoln diverted McClellan's anticipated reinforcements to chase Stonewall Jackson, whose lighting feints in the Shenandoah Valley seemed to put Washington, D.C. in jeopardy. Stalled in front of Richmond, McClellan was further frustrated when Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry rode completely around his army on reconnaissance. The then General Robert E. Lee launched a devastating counterattack, the 7 Days Battles, June 26 to July 2, 1862. The Confederates slowly drove McClellan back to the sea. The Union forces abandoned the Peninsula Campaign as a costly failure, and Lincoln temporarily abandoned McClellan as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, though Lee's army had suffered some 20,000 casualties to McClellan's 10,000. Lee had achieved a brilliant, if bloody, triumph, yet the ironies of his accomplishment are striking. If McClellan had succeeded in taking Richmond and ending the war in mid-1862, the Union would probably have been restored with minimal disruption to the peculiar institution. Slavery would have survived, at least for a time, but his successful defense of Richmond and defeat of McClellan, Lee had in effect ensured that the war would endure until slavery was uprooted and the Old South thoroughly destroyed. Lincoln himself, who had earlier professed his unwillingness to tamper with slavery where it already existed, now declared that the rebels cannot experiment for 10 years trying to destroy the government, and if they fail, still come back into the Union unhurt. He began to draft an Emancipation Proclamation. Union strategy now turned toward total war. As finally developed, the Northern military plan had 6 components. First, slowly suffocate the South by blockading its coasts. Second, liberate the slaves and hence undermine the very economic foundations of the Old South. Third, cut the Confederacy in half by seizing control of the Mississippi River backbone. Fourth, chop the Confederacy to pieces by sending troops to Georgia and the Carolinas. Fifth, decapitate it by capturing its capital at Richmond. And sixth, try everywhere to engage the enemy's main strength and to grind it into submission. The War at Sea. The blockade started legally. It was not clamped down all at once, but it was extended by degrees. A watertight patrol of some 3,500 miles of coast was impossible for the hastily improvised Northern Navy, which counted converted yachts and ferryboats in its fleet. But blockading was simplified by concentrating on the principal ports and inlets where dock facilities were available for loading bulky bales of cotton. How was the blockade regarded by the naval powers of the world? Ordinarily, they probably would have defied it, for it was never completely effective and was especially sieve-like at the outset. But Britain, the greatest maritime nation, recognized it as binding and warned its shippers that they ignored it at their peril. Britain plainly did not want to tie its hands in a future war by insisting that Lincoln maintain impossibly high blockading standards. Blockade running was risky but profitable, as the growing scarcity of southern goods drove prices skyward. The most successful blockade runners were swift, gray-painted steamers, scores of which were specially built in Scotland. A leading rendezvous was the West Indies ports of Nassau in the British Bahamas, where at one time 35 of the speedy ships rode at anchor. The low-lying craft would take on cargoes of arms brought in by tramp steamers from Britain, leave with the fraudulent papers for Halifax, Canada, and then return a few days later with a cargo of cotton. The risks were great, but the profits would mount to 700% and more for the lucky gamblers. 2 successful voyages might well pay for capture on a third. The lush days of blockade running finally passed as Union squadrons gradually pinched off the leading southern ports, from New Orleans to Charleston. The Northern Navy enforced the blockade with high-handed practices. Yankee captains, for example, would seize British freighters on the high seas, if laden with war supplies for the tiny port of Nassau and other halfway stations. The justifications was that obviously these shipments were ultimately destined by devious routes for the Confederacy. London, although not happy, acquiesced in this disagreeable doctrine of ultimate destination or continuous voyage. British blockaders might need to take advantage of the same far-fetched interpretation in a future war, as in fact they did in the World War of 1914 to 1918. The most alarming Confederate threat to the blockade came in 1862. Resourceful Southerners raised and reconditioned a former wooden U.S. warship, the Merrimac, and plated its side with old iron railroad rails. Renamed the Virginia, this clumsy but powerful monster easily destroyed 2 wooden ships of the Union Navy in the Virginia waters of the Chesapeake Bay. It also threatened catastrophe to the entire Yankee blockading fleet. Actually, the homemade ironclad was not a seaworthy craft. A tiny Union ironclad, the Monitor, built in about 100 days, arrived on the scene in the nick of time. For 4 hours on March 9, 1862, the little Yankee cheese box on a raft fought the wheezy Merrimac to a standstill. Britain and France had already built several powerful ironclads, but the first battle testing of these new craft heralded the doom of wooden warships. A few months after the historic battle, the Confederates destroyed the Merrimac to keep it from the grasp of advancing Union troops. Whew. Sorry, my throat's not clear. The pivotal point, Antietam. Is it Antietam? I think it's Antietam. Robert E. Lee, having broken the back of McClellan's assault on Richmond, next moved northward. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, he encountered a Federal force under General John Pope, a handsome, dashing, soldierly figure. Pope boasted that in the western theater of the war from which he had recently come, he had seen only the backs of the enemy. Lee quickly gave him a front view, furiously attacking Pope's troops and inflicting a crushing defeat. Emboldened by this success, Lee daringly thrust into Maryland. He had hoped to strike a blow that would not only encourage foreign intervention, but also seduce the still wavering border state and its sisters from the Union. The Confederate troops sang lustily, "Thou wilt not cower in the dust, Maryland, my Maryland. Thy gleaming sword shall never rust, Maryland, my Maryland." But the Marylanders did not respond to the siren song. The presence among the invaders of so many blanketless, hatless, and shoeless soldiers dampened the state's ardor. Events finally converged toward a critical battle in Antietam Creek, Maryland. Lincoln, yielding to the popular pressure, hastily restored Little Mac to active command of the main Northern army. His soldiers tossed their caps skyward and hugged his horse as they hailed his return. Fortune shone upon McClellan when 2 Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around a packet of 3 cigars dropped by a careless Confederate officer. With this crucial piece of intelligence in hand, McClellan succeeded in halting Lee at Antietam on September 17, 1862, in one of the bitterest and bloodiest days of the war. Antietam was more or less a draw militarily, but Lee, finding his thrust parried, retired across the Potomac. McClellan, from whom much more had been hoped, was removed from his field command for the second and final time. His numerous critics, condemning him for not having boldly pursued the ever-dangerous Lee, finally got his scalp. The landmark Battle of Antietam was one of the most decisive engagements of world history, probably the most decisive of the Civil War. Jefferson Davis was perhaps never again so near victory as on that fateful summer day. The British and French governments were on the verge of diplomatic mediation, a form of interference sure to be angrily resented by the North. An almost certain rebuff by Washington might well have spurred Paris and London into armed collusion with Richmond, but both capitals cooled off when the Union displayed unexpected power at Antietam, and their chill deepened with the passing months. Bloody Antietam was also the long-awaited victory that Lincoln needed for launching his Emancipation Proclamation. The abolitionists had long been clamoring for action. Wendell Phillips was denouncing the president as a first-rate, second-rate man. By midsummer of 1862, with the border states safely in the fold, Lincoln was ready to move. But he believed that to issue such an edict on the heels of a series of military disasters would be folly. It would seem like a confession that the North, unable to conquer the South, was forced to call upon slaves to murder their masters. Lincoln therefore decided to wait for the outcome of Lee's invasion. Antietam served as the needed emancipation springboard. The halting of Lee's offensive was just enough of a victory to justify Lincoln's issuing, on September 23, 1862, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This hope-giving document announced that on January 1, 1863, the president would issue a final proclamation. On the scheduled date, he fully redeemed his promise. "If my name ever goes into history," Lincoln declared, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." With the fateful stroke of the president's pen, the Civil War now became more of a moral crusade, as well as what Lincoln called a remorseless revolutionary struggle. After January 1, 1863, Lincoln said the character of the war will be changed. It will be one of subjugation. The Old South is to be destroyed and replaced by new propositions and ideas. A proclamation without emancipation. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared forever free the slaves in those Confederate areas still in rebellion. Bondsmen in the loyal border states were not affected, nor were those in specific conquered areas in the South. All told, about 800,000. The tone of the document was dull and legalistic. One historian has said that it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. But if Lincoln stopped short of a clarion call for a holy war to achieve freedom, he pointedly concluded his historic document by declaring that the proclamation was an act of justice, and calling for the considerate judgment of mankind in the gracious favor of Almighty God. The presidential pen did not formally strike the shackles from a single slave. Where Lincoln could presumably free the slaves, that is, in the loyal border states, he had refused to do so, lest he spur disunion. Where he could not, that is, in the Confederate states, he tried to. In short, where he could, he would not, and where he would, he could not. Thus the Emancipation Proclamation was stronger on the proclamation than emancipation. Yet much unofficial do-it-yourself liberation did take place. Thousands of jubilant slaves, learning of the proclamation, flocked to the invading Union armies, stripping already run-down plantations of their workforce. In this sense, the Emancipation Proclamation was heralded by the drumbeat of running feet, but many fugitives would have come anyhow, as they had from the war's outset. 1 in 7 Southern slaves ran away to Union camps. Their presence in the camps and their perseverance against all odds convinced many Northern soldiers of slavery's evils, and helped put emancipation atop Lincoln's agenda. By issuing the proclamation, Lincoln addressed the refugees' plight and strengthened the moral cause of the Unions at home and abroad. At the same time, Lincoln's proclamation clearly foreshadowed the ultimate doom of slavery. This was legally achieved by action of the individual states by their ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, 8 months after the Civil War had ended. The Emancipation Proclamation also fundamentally changed the nature of the war because it effectively removed any chance of negotiated settlement. Both sides now knew that the war would be a fight to the finish. Public reactions to the long-awaited proclamation of 1863 were varied. "God bless Abraham Lincoln," exulted the anti-slavery editor Horace Greeley in his New York Tribune, but many ardent abolitionists complained that Lincoln had not gone far enough. On the other hand, formidable numbers of Northerners, especially in the butternut regions of Old Northwest and the border states, felt that he had gone too far. A cynical Democratic rhymester quipped, "Honest old Abe, when the war first began, denied abolition was part of his plan. Honest old Abe has since made a decree, the war must go on till the slaves are all free. As both can't be honest, will someone tell how? If honest Abe then, is he honest Abe now?" Opposition mounted in the North against supporting an abolition war. Ex-President Pierce and others felt that emancipation should not be inflicted on the slaves. Many boys in blue, especially from the border states, had volunteered to fight for the Union, not against slavery. Desertions increased sharply. The crucial congressional elections in the autumn of 1862 went heavily against the administration, particularly in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Democrats even carried Lincoln's Illinois, although they did not secure control of Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation caused an outcry to rise from the South that Lincoln the Fiend was trying to stir up the hellish passions of a slave insurrection. Aristocrats of Europe, noting that the proclamation applied only to rebel slaveholders, were inclined to sympathize with Southern protests, but the old world working classes, especially in Britain, reacted otherwise. They sensed that the proclamation spelled the ultimate doom of slavery, and many laborers were more determined than ever to oppose intervention. Gradually, the diplomatic position of the Union improved. The North now had much the stronger moral cause. In addition to preserving the Union, it had committed itself to freeing the slaves. The moral position of the South was correspondingly diminished. Blacks battle bondage. As Lincoln moved to emancipate the slaves, he also took steps to enlist blacks in the armed forces. Although some African Americans had served in the Revolution in the War of 1812, the regular army contained no blacks at the war's outset, and the War Department refused to accept those free Northern blacks who tried to volunteer. The Union Navy, however, enrolled many blacks, mainly as cooks, stewards, and firemen. But as manpower ran low and emancipation was proclaimed, black enlistees were accepted, sometimes over ferocious protests from Northern as well as Southern whites. By war's end, some 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army, most of them from the slave states, but many from the Free Soil North. Blacks accounted for about 10% of the total enlistments in the Union forces on land and sea, and included 2 Massachusetts regiments raised largely through the efforts of the ex-slave Frederick Douglass. Black fighting men unquestionably had their hearts in the war against slavery that the Civil War had become after Lincoln proclaimed emancipation. Service also offered them a chance to prove their manhood and to strengthen their claim to full citizenship at war's end. Participating in about 500 engagements, they received a total of 22 Congressional Medals of Honor, the highest military award. Their casualties were extremely heavy. More than 38,000 died, whether from battle, sickness, or reprisals from vengeful masters. Many, when captured, were put to death as slaves in revolt, for not until 1864 did the South recognize them as prisoners of war. In one notorious case, several black soldiers were massacred after they had formerly surrendered at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Thereafter, vengeful black units cried, "Remember Fort Pillow," as they swung into battle and vowed to take no prisoners. For reasons of pride, prejudice, and principle, the Confederacy could not bring itself to enlist slaves until a month before the war ended, and then it was too late. Meanwhile, tens of thousands were forced into labor battalions, the building of fortifications, the supplying of armies, and other war-connected activities. Slaves, moreover, were the stomach of the Confederacy, for they kept the farms going while the white men fought. Involuntary labor did not imply slave support for the Confederacy. In many ways, the actions of Southern slaves hamstrung the Confederate war effort and subverted the institution of slavery. Fear of slave insurrection necessitated Confederate home guards, keeping many eligible young white men from the front. Everyday forms of slave resistance, such as slowdowns, strikes, and open defiance, diminished productivity and undermined discipline. When Union troops neared, slave assertiveness increased. As intelligent contraband, slaves served as Union spies, guides, and scouts, or provided shelter to escaped Northern prisoners of war. By the war's end, nearly 500,000 slaves took the ultimate risk of revolting with their feet, abandoning their plantations. Many who remained, especially in the urban South, negotiated new working conditions in factories and on farms. Although they stopped short of violent uprising, slaves contributed powerfully to the collapse of slavery and the disintegration of antebellum Southern way of life. Lee's last lunge at Gettysburg. After Antietam, Lincoln replaced McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac with General A.E. Burnside, whose ornate side whiskers came to be known as Burnsides, or sideburns. Protesting his unfitness for responsibility, Burnside proved it when he launched a rash frontal attack on Lee's strong position at Fredericksburg, Virginia, on December 13, 1862. "A chicken could not have lived in the line of the fire," remarked one Confederate officer. More than 10,000 Northern soldiers were killed or wounded in Burnside's slaughter pen. A new slaughter pen was prepared when General Burnside yielded his command to Joseph, fighting Joe Hooker, an aggressive officer but a strong, headstrong subordinate. At Chancellorsville, Virginia, on May 2nd to 4th, 1863, Lee daringly divided his numerically inferior force and sent Stonewall Jackson to attack the Union flank. The strategy worked. Hooker, temporarily dazed by a near hit from a cannonball, was badly beaten, but not crushed. This victory was probably Lee's most brilliant, but it was dearly bought. Jackson was mistakenly shot by his own men in the gathering dusk and died a few days later. "I've lost my right arm," lamented Lee. Southern folklore relates how Jackson outflanked the angels while galloping into heaven. Lee now prepared to follow up his stunning victory by invading the North again, this time through Pennsylvania. A decisive blow would add strength to the noisy peace prodders in the North and would also encourage foreign intervention. Still a Southern hope. 3 days before the battle was joined, Union General George G. Meade, scholarly, unspectacular, and abrupt, was aroused from his sleep at 2 a.m. with the unwelcome news that he would replace Hooker. Quite by accident, Meade took his stand atop a low ridge flanking a shallow valley near the quiet Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There, his 92,000 men in blue locked in furious combat. Excuse me. Sorry, my throat. Okay. There, his 92,000 men in blue locked in furious combat with Lee's 76,000 gray-clad warriors. The battle seesawed. Seesawed. I thought it said seesawed. Seesawed across the rolling green slopes for 3 agonizing days, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, and the outcome was in doubt until the very end. The failure of General George Pickett's magnificent but futile charge finally broke the back of the Confederate attack, and broke the heart of the Confederate cause. Pickett's charge has been called the high tide of the Confederacy. It defined both the northernmost point reached by any significant Southern force, and the last real chance for the Confederates to win the war. As the Battle of Gettysburg raged, a Confederate peace delegation was moving under a flag of truce toward the Union lines near Norfolk, Virginia. Jefferson Davis hoped his negotiators would arrive in Washington from the south just as Lee's triumphant army marched on it from Gettysburg to the north. But the victory at Gettysburg belonged to Lincoln, who refused to allow the Confederate peace mission to pass through Union lines. From now on, the Southern cause was doomed, yet the men of Dixie fought for nearly 2 years longer, through sweat, blood, and weariness of spirit. Later in the dreary autumn of 1863, with the grave still fresh, Lincoln journeyed to Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery. He read a 2-minute address following a 2-hour speech by the orator of the day, a former president of Harvard. Lincoln's noble remarks were branded by the London Times as ludicrous and by Democratic editors as dishwatery and silly. The Gettysburg address attracted relatively little attention at the time, but the president was speaking for the ages. Okay, I think that's all. Wow. My tongue is like... Okay. Yay.